Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to warmly welcome all of you who joined us on today's webinar. My name is Panellists, and I'm with the Humanitarian Reform, the Senior Transformative Agenda Implementation Team. In today's webinar, we've asked our speakers to answer the $1 billion question. We've asked them to give us their insights, their practical tips from a leadership point of view on the Central Emergency Response Fund funding. The questions that we'll be asking them is really to give us their insight, their analysis, their critical top tips on how to go about it. Tips that I hope will be useful for all of you joining us from different parts of the world on today's conversation. But before introducing the speakers and the topic a little bit further, I'd like to say a few words about the webinar, and in particular about the platform, the VoiceBox platform that we're using today for the first time. First of all, this webinar would last for 60 minutes. During the first 30 minutes, I will be asking questions to our two speakers, and they will be providing us their reflections to introduce the topic. During the second 30 minutes, I'll be taking your questions. I'll be directing them to our speakers to get their reflections on specific issues you may have in the operation, wherever you're joining us from. I'm delighted to say that today's webinar, for the first time, it's being broadcasted not only in English, but also with simultaneous interpretation in French, Arabic, and Spanish. I hope this makes it easier, more accessible to colleagues all over the world to be able to listen to the language of option. If you want to switch to another language, if you look at your screen on the bottom, slightly to the right-hand side, you see there is a click which says your language. If you press into that, you will be able to choose the language of preference. As I said, French, Arabic, or Spanish. I would also like to highlight that on the right-hand side, you see there is a button under the title Chat Channel. If you press into that, you will see that it gives you some options, general, where if you click into general, you will be able to have a conversation with all participants. One of the successful features of a webinar is that it provides a platform for all speakers to also share best practice, share information, comment, chat live as the presenters will be talking. So I really want to encourage you all to use the chat channel. I repeat, it's under chat channel, groups, general, and then you can talk with everybody. I also want to encourage you to send your questions. Actually, from the get-go, from this very moment, or at any moment throughout this webinar, please feel free to send your question. Again, under chat channel, groups, there is a button which says questions. And if you send a question from there, it comes directly to me, and I will be taking these questions during the second half of the webinar in about 30 minutes or so. And I will be asking our speakers to give their views on the questions you'll be sending us. Now, there's also a help question mark. So if you have any issues or technical issues, on the bottom left-hand side of the screen, you see a question mark. If you click into that help, you'll be able to get live support. If you have connectivity issues or any other issues as we go, you'll be able to, we will be able to support you. There is a dedicated person on live on standby to help you with any connectivity issues. I also want to particularly let colleagues who are in deep field locations, if you're having a problem with the connectivity with the internet, if the audio for whatever reason is not as strong as or as clear, you can go into YouTube and listen to this webinar live. It's very simple. Connect through the internet to YouTube and then type the title of the webinar. State webinar, the $1 billion question, how can field leaders leverage CERF funding? And you'll be able to listen to this webinar live through the live stream that takes place. Today's webinar will be recorded and will be available online for anybody who would want to listen to it. It will come up in a few days at the state website, deliveraidbetter.org. So this is really in terms of introduction for the voice box. And as I said, please send questions as the speakers talk, and feel free. I encourage you to exchange through the chat box with conversations with everybody. So in today's topic, we're really focusing in particular about CERF, the Central Emergency Response Fund. During the last 10 years, over $4.3 billion have been distributed in over 96 countries through CERF allocations. For all of us who have worked in field operations, we're very familiar with the process, but really more importantly, the value of being able to get the funds either through the underfunded window or through the rapid response window at times of crisis, at times where we really desperately need them. Of course, gratitude goes to the donors who generously contribute this fund, enabling humanitarian coordinators, enabling decision makers, because a decision is made at the field level, empowering humanitarian coordinators to be able to make the right choice, to put forward the right decision in terms of the CERF funding. Now, to answer to your questions and to my questions, I'd like to introduce the panelists, and I'm really delighted we have two distinguished colleagues who are joining us today. So with me here in New York, where I'm this morning presenting this webinar, I'd like to introduce Lisa Doughten. Lisa is the chief of the UN Central Emergency Response Fund. Lisa has had a very long, distinguished career with actually more than, with a couple of UN agencies, with OCHA, with the World Food Program. She has worked with USAID. She has worked in more than 30 countries in Africa, Asia, Europe, Latin America, and the Middle East. Actually, this wealth of field experience, I think, reflects very well, including in the examples she will be sharing with us in a few minutes. So Lisa, welcome, and we're delighted to have you on this webinar. I'd like also to introduce Stephen Tull. Stephen is the resident coordinator and humanitarian coordinator in Chad, one of the most complex and challenging operations in the world, with enormous humanitarian needs that range from refugees, IDPs, health issues, climate displacement issues, poverty, really you name it, enormous needs, and quite a sizable operation that is coordinated under the leadership of Stephen. Stephen has also worked before coming to his current position. He was in Kazakhstan, but also he has worked with OCHA in Geneva, in the former Yugoslavia, in Afghanistan, in Russia Federation, has also worked with the Office of the Commission of Human Rights, and has had a career as well in academia and journalism as well, and in private consulting. Stephen, welcome, and we're delighted to have you with us live from Chad for this conversation. So I'd like actually to take you now to our first speaker, to Lisa, and just to get the conversation going, I would like to ask you, Lisa, if you can tell us a little bit. What is the latest with the Central Emergency Response Fund with CERF? I understand it was quite central, the discussion on the World Humanitarian Forum. There is some major announcement that has come up in terms of increasing the fund to 1 billion by 2018. It'd be great if we can hear your reflection in terms of where CERF is, where it's going, and most importantly, what does this mean for field colleagues? Lisa, over to you.
Great, thank you very much, Panos, and welcome to everyone around the world who's joined this webinar. It is a perfect complement to the webinars and the workshops that we do in country as well to help improve the strategic prioritization of the CERF and the impact of CERF in the end. But I think more directly to your question, Panos, what does $1 billion CERF mean? That is a very important question for us, and I think I would like to go through a few points. What will not change, first of all, I think most importantly. it will remain a country-driven process. It's CERF prioritization is always country-driven despite being a global fund, and it will continue to strengthen HC leadership and coordination, and it will kickstart life-saving action at the earliest stages. It will also continue to be a key funding source for underfunded or forgotten emergencies. One of the things that will likely change, that we intend to have change, is the flexibility between the rapid response and underfunded emergency windows. As most of you will know, 2/3 of the funding that CERF grants is for rapid response funding window, and 1/3 to the underfunded. So we expect that there will be some increase in flexibility between those two, which will help HCs have better flexibility or greater flexibility in defining a rapid response trigger. It will also make CERF able to fund a higher percentage of the funding requirements of an emergency. And I think what will change, importantly, several things will change with the $1 billion CERF. Obviously, there will be larger grants, which would mean larger overall allocations or more funding for individual emergencies, which would increase CERF's strategic impact and added value while reducing transaction costs. This will mean more unearmarked funding for HCs and HCTs to prioritize and leverage improved leadership coordination and coherence. And I think above all, because we hear from all of the donors that we need to really focus on results. And with the 10 years of experience that CERF has now in providing grants, I would like to just list a few of the achievements. So CERF funding has enabled partners to deliver critical health care to 20 million people every year on average, food assistance to 10 million people, water sanitation to 8 million people, livelihood support to 5 million, and protection services to 4 million. And of course, other sectors, as all of you will know, that CERF provides funding to. So, Panos.
Thank you, Lisa. It's impressive to really see CERF growing and, as you mentioned, really making more unearmarked funding for humanitarian coordinators and humanitarian countries at the field level. Having been a humanitarian coordinator and in operations in the field, whenever we go about preparing a CERF submission, the key question that goes everybody's mind is, how can I make sure that my organization or my priorities basically are the ones that come forward? Having received so many requests from all over the world, I wanted to ask you, what are the practical tips that you will give to humanitarian coordinators, to humanitarian country teams in terms of making CERF requests successful? What are the things that work? What are the things that when you see a request, you say, oh my God, you know, that definitely is a no-no. And of course, often the dilemma is, how do you decide? Do I go with a request for a tiny location? Do I go for a request that covers an issue throughout the country? How to decide from a leadership point of view in terms of making sure that one submits the right request? Over to you.
Okay, thank you. Yes, that is incredibly important because we do receive many requests and we fund about 50 different countries every year. So obviously there's no shortage of needs across the globe. So on the slide here, the participants will see some of the signs of a strong CERF request and a submission. So first of all, targeted on specific geographic locations and to the people who have the greatest needs. So that's the first one. And secondly, those submissions that have a clear strategy and show prioritization focus of life-saving needs. And most of you will be aware of the life-saving criteria that each of the submissions and projects need to adhere to. And then lastly, to mention here is a limited number of projects. So Panos, you had mentioned, you know, do you cover the country, but really looking at a limited number of projects that will bring the maximum impact on the ground. And I think to illustrate this, I wanted to provide two examples. And of course, Stephen will have a very excellent on the ground examples as well. But I'll start first with the example of Yemen. In 2015, Yemen was the largest CERF recipient. And following the spread of the conflict, the HC had requested and received $25 million from CERF for the response. But as the conflict escalated, more support was required to enable humanitarian action. And as a result, CERF allocated another $2.5 million to Yemen for emergency telecoms, logistics, and security. So these were the enabling factors or sectors that would enable a broader response. And then again in September 2015, there was another spike of new IDPs for which CERF allocated $15 million to address health, protection, and shelter. So you can see each of these requests was very specific and targeted toward a particular need as different spikes and different triggers were identified, and they were very well prioritized. And the next example I wanted to give is that of South Sudan. So as CERF's purpose is to kickstart activity, it should never be a large percentage of the funding, cover the large percentage of the funding needs, which means complementarity with other sources is important. And although CERF funds projects, as I mentioned, in 50 different countries, about half of those are countries where there are country-based pooled funds. And so the example I wanted to show here is South Sudan, which in 2013, with the new, at the time, new humanitarian crisis, the HC at the time, Toby Lanzer, had asked for a rapid response request of $15 million. Now, it took a little bit longer to provide, for him to provide the strategic prioritization, but for very good reasons. He needed to reprioritize over $40 million of projects that were being funded by the South Sudan Pooled Fund. And he wanted to ensure that that CERF was prioritized toward the enabling sector. So you can see on this slide, the yellow part of the bar graph is where CERF funding came in under security, logistics, and camp management. And then the orange bars were the projects that were being reprioritized to some of these other sectors. So overall, sort of it worked in concert to be complementary in funding, and that goes not only for country-based pooled funds, but also funding that is received bilaterally. And then the next one is I would call the top tips slide. It's important to note that a well-prioritized submission is not a one-size-fits-all, and that it should have several different points, and I'll just list some of them off here. One, that it should set a narrow strategic objective, so it's not catching all projects there, all objectives. It's not attempting to do that. And secondly, that there's a small number of projects, which I mentioned before, but that address the true priorities of the affected people. And thirdly, isolate and focus on what can be done now and not later for a more comprehensive response. So it's not meant to be a mini HRP and cover everything. It should be very much targeted. And then the next one is CERF is meant to jumpstart a response, so ensure that the projects with a long startup time are not included. Generally, those that can be under rapid response can be implemented 3 to 4 month time period. And then, of course, you need to take into account the capacity to absorb the funding and make sure that the agencies have that ability to implement the projects within that time frame, 6 months for rapid response and 9 months for underfunded. Ensure that requests are not being made to bridge a funding gap, an agency funding gap. So many times you'll get questions about pipeline breaks, and the CERF is not meant to fund pipeline breaks. If we did that, we'd be broke in the first month. And then 2 more points for a rapid response request, just a tip that you can submit a concept note, which is a 1-page tool, before making a full application. This is done generally when the trigger may not be clear, if you're not sure whether it could constitute a trigger for rapid response funding. So, for example, if there's a significant or sudden deterioration in a drought emergency or a spike in the influx of refugees. So the team here, the program team, is always available by phone or to discuss possibility of a concept note. And I would also mention that countries don't need to spend time on a concept note when the trigger is very clear. And 2 examples of that would be the Ecuador earthquake earlier this year, and of course the recent Hurricane Matthew, both which CERF provided funding to. And then lastly, as you can see on this slide, there are people grabbing pieces of cake. CERF is not a cake cutting or cake sharing exercise in which everybody gets a piece. So this is where the leadership of the HC and the leadership of the HC team members is crucial. You really must make sure that it is prioritized the most important sectors following some of these tips that I mentioned, and not that everybody gets a piece of the cake. And we can also play the bad cop if need be. So we can always discuss that and how we can play bad cop. We've done that in several situations, but just to offer that up. So those would be my top tips.
Lisa, thank you so much. It's really superb. I was writing as fast as I could while you were talking to capture all these really valuable points. The narrow objective, the targeted, the capacity to absorb, really not to fill a funding gap. It is not about cutting the cake to equal number of pieces per ages around the table. It is about being strategic, being selective, targeting well. I want to remind everybody that all of you who have participated to the webinar or registered, we will send you a summary which will include this top tips and the main points that came up from both speakers, so that you also get them. I also have next to me here Samir, who also works on the CERF, and he's available on the chat, actually frantically sending email, telephone numbers, contact numbers for all of you who want to reach the CERF colleagues who have a question, to be able really to interact live as we go through this conversation. I'd like to take us now to our next speaker, and we have Stephen Tal, who is joining us from Chad, the humanitarian coordinator. So Stephen, wonderful to have you with us. You have clearly one of the most challenging jobs in the world, working in a context which is really so complex, with extremely challenging setting and needs, ranging from food insecurity, population displacement, refugees, IDPs, conflict, poverty, you name it, really a wide range of issues in country. I wanted to ask you, Stephen, and we're very much interested on your own experience, having been a humanitarian coordinator and from the chair where you're sitting now, if you can tell us how did you go practically, how did you go about prioritizing what to put forward in CERF in a context where many would argue that really it's almost impossible to prioritize? How did you do it when everything appears or seems to be a priority in terms of moving forward with the CERF application? Stephen, over to you. Stephen, we seem to have a technical problem. Please make sure your video is disconnected, and the audio, we will send it back to you. I'm not sure if you can hear me, but we will try again, and I hope next time last time we saw you, but we didn't hear you. So we hope this time we can hear you. So we're transferring over to you, Stephen. Technical questions, and while colleagues are trying to sort it out, I've already started receiving questions from listeners, and maybe I'll take a question and we'll come back to you, Stephen. In the meantime, I want to remind everybody about the questions button and the chat also option. So if you look at the right-hand side below the audio-only microphone, there is a chat channel button, and if you are on your mouse, click on the left side of your mouse. On the right hand side of the screen, there is a general option where you can chat with the colleagues, and there is also a questions option where you can answer. And Lisa, we have a colleague, I assume it's somebody who works with an NGO, who just sent a question which says, how can NGOs really apply to CERF? Isn't this just for the UN, and why is it really not changing? I mean, NGOs worldwide are the ones who are implementing by large projects and operations. So how can they access these vital funds, and can they come directly to the CERF Secretariat? Lisa.
Okay, thank you for that question. It's an important one. I think especially as we're moving to $1 billion, this is the maybe billion-dollar question, because we do continue to receive this. And I would say that when the CERF was created, when it created the grant component in 2006 as part of the humanitarian reform, the General Assembly had directed that the funding would only go towards directly to UN recipients. Now, of course, UN agency recipients work very closely with implementing partners. So at the moment, and I foresee this to continue to be, that the partnership between the agencies and their implementing partners is very strong. And I do have some data that I wanted to mention from the last year that we have full data, 2014. Out of the $471 million that CERF allocated, almost a quarter of that was implemented by partners, by NGOs, by host governments, civil society. And of that 25%, in fact, over half of that, 13% of the total funding for that year, was implemented by national partners. So it's a spread and breadth of reaching partners that is not necessarily available through other means. And so although NGOs are not direct recipients, I would mention that as part of the Grand Bargain discussions earlier this year, as part of the World Humanitarian Summit, there was a question that was placed in that document saying that CERF should explore the possibility. So we will be developing, we'll be looking into it, analyzing it, talking with partners and trying to see, does it make sense? If so, how would the General Assembly actually allow for something like this? So it's a good question, but I did want to note that it's an important funding source, and we always encourage that NGO partners, where they're part of the HCTs in the field, are part of the discussions on how to prioritize CERF submissions, because it's important, as you mentioned, that that NGOs are incredibly important implementing partners. So they should be part of determining what sectors are prioritized and the different people that should be prioritized as well.
Thanks, Lisa. So hopefully more to come, really, as we're moving in this direction, and then certainly goes along with the mindset and the approach at the World Humanitarian Summit, particularly with regards to localization and further strengthening local partnerships. I understand that the technical issue with the connection with Chad has been resolved, so I'm going to take us back to Stephen, and I'm going to ask my question very briefly. Stephen, I hope you can hear me, and I hope we can hear you. My question is, how did you go and chat about prioritizing what to put forward for the CERF grant in a context where one would argue that really everything is a priority, everything is needed? How could you decide what to put forward? Stephen, over to you.
I think we have the microphone working now, so I'll just continue. I think the kinds of tips that Lisa gave are very important, and I'd like to start on this with, you'll have a slide which shows a few of the points of advice. If you can go to the next slide. I'll go in a slightly different order from the bullets on that slide, but I want to start by saying one of the tips here was to prioritize the specific crisis in country and take a crisis-based needs and gap analysis. We have in Chad, really in our HRP, 3 distinct crises: food insecurity, malnutrition, population displacement, and thirdly, health emergencies. And there's a geographical correspondence with those. So while we already had in the HRP a prioritization, it was really useful during the CERF process to deepen and focus more on new needs assessment or updating our needs assessment before we started the round of consultations on prioritization. That is, get really as up-to-date as possible, needs assessment as you could in order to identify the gaps. Then second point on the slides on this, which I think we'll get up next, is that to establish a clear time frame and matrix of responsibilities. This is important for transparency and accountability. Here in Chad, in February 2015, the HCT developed a country operational guidance based on the CERF guidelines, which clarified roles and responsibilities and even included an organization chart for the process. And this has been used in all the CERF allocations since then. A third point in this area is, in my view, is that OCHA office needs to be fully engaged in all of the key steps of the process. For example, during our last CERF underfunded proposal in the summer of 2016, the OCHA office engaged in consultations with the subclusters and partners in the field offices in the south of Chad, which was our geographical focus. And they guided the discussions there, as well as in the ICC and in the clusters. This ensured compliance with the guidelines of the CERF, as well as OCHA being able to offer support to agencies then in developing their proposals further. A fourth point is really, I think it's important to have informed leadership through a feedback cycle, and the feedback cycle including the clusters, the ICC, and the HCT. The key is to have a strong and functioning coordination system, and this will, the communication and the needs assessment in such a system will give the HC and the HCT the information they need to make the decisions, and really at all levels. Here in Chad, the preliminary data collection and analysis of vulnerabilities came from the field, and it was analyzed and compiled by the clusters at the national level, which then informed the ICC on the priorities, and the ICC acted as an area to filter those priorities and then give feedback to the HCT and the HC. Part of this also, the analysis, is to look at past CERF allocations. As you probably know, here in Chad we had 2 CERF allocations from a rapid response window in the past, within a span of 4 months for Lake Chad Basin. And so it was very important to look for complementarity between those two, and then also when we went to the underfunded window for a third disbursement in June. So I think really the tip here is that well-informed strategic discussions within the HCT, ICT, ICC, and clusters here led to unanimity on a decisions, and then the HC's job is basically to check that and validate the result. Just finally, very quickly, last point is to ensure you have dynamic consultation with a broader group of stakeholders. Here in Chad, it really helped that we had active engagement by national and international NGOs in all the process of prioritization, but also we spoke with the donors, and including the World Bank as a key development donor, but which was getting involved more in the field, addressing vulnerabilities that were impacting upon the humanitarian situation. So by our consultations, we were able to get a better idea of the forecasted funding from these other sources, and also ensure complementarity with the CERF. Over to you, Panos.
Thanks, Stephen, and really useful to see these 5 bullet points with the practical ways you went about looking at the needs, getting the HCT basically on board, this leadership discussion that is really important to be able to take it to a strategic level and facilitate a conversation that brings everybody together around what is really the people priorities driven by situation and the extreme needs on the ground. Stephen, if I can come back to you with a question. I mean, you've now done a few submissions. You've been one of the countries that has received the most. You're among the top 5 CERF clients, so to speak. So I wanted to ask you, you talked about all the successes. I'm going to ask you the other way. What are the challenges you face? What were really the problems you encountered from your personal experience when you went through putting forward, and what lessons can other colleagues learn from your experience as we go? Stephen, over to you.
Challenges, indeed. You know, it's not easy. It's a complicated environment here, and our funding level has been low. So there's a lot of competition, and there's a lot of needs to be met. I would say that without kind of repeating some of the points that I mentioned before, the data analysis and consultation, beginning at the field level and going all the way up, is extremely important. On the next slide, you'll see some key points, I'd say. Identifying niches for the rapid response and the underfunded allocation. Again, here we had the benefit of 2 rapid response and 1 underfunded within the course of 1 year. And I think it's important to look at the whole HRP and the tendencies in the country of the year and think of what's the appropriate use for the respective windows of the CERF. Also, one of the most important tips is to consult with the CERF Secretariat. I had a face-to-face meeting in February in New York with Vesna and Jessica Bowers to talk about, that was after we had done the first rapid response proposal for the lake, and we were looking at a second one with a new caseload, and also talked some for their advice on the underfunded window. Also, throughout the year, and especially at the time of preparing the proposals, the OCHA team in particular and the ICC consulted regularly with the Secretariat, and that really helped a lot. So I use these consultations and our own initial discussions on priorities to identify the niches for the respective windows. So when we were talking about the rapid response for the lake, as I say, we were already noticing that there were going to be some serious issues in the south of Chad coming up, and that was where we began already to pre-think about the underfunded window as an opportunity to boost that, and that already led us to prioritization. Second point is to fill knowledge gaps about the CERF guidelines. So in each of the last 3 CERF allocations, we had a CERF webinar facilitated from the CERF Secretariat to reinforce the knowledge of all the partners. Also in September last month, we had a in-country training for HCT and ICC and other colleagues from the CERF Secretariat on the idea that we really need everyone to know the process and stay engaged in thinking about how to use it. Another point is to use the ICC to navigate the competition for funds among agencies and clusters. I really think this is an extremely important tool for HCs and to navigate, as I say, but also really to ensure transparency and inclusiveness in the process. Here in Chad, the ICC and the cluster groups indeed were the appropriate entry point for most of the discussion on priorities. And as I mentioned, once we had a feedback, so within the context of an already well-functioning coordination system, and we had a system of feedback from the clusters and ICC into the HCT and vice versa. So by the time that we had the prioritization from the ICC, we had good confidence, and I had good confidence that the due consultations had taken place on the priorities. We used the same, once there was a CERF allocation indicated, we used the same method for trying to deal with the disbursement decisions within a given cluster, and that worked well here as well. Fourthly, consolidate needs assessment and needs assessments and supplement them as necessary. I spoke a little bit about that before, but let me add that the CERF process actually can be seen as a tool for catalyzing our humanitarian assistance and an incentive for initiating assessments and taking action, for example, getting more access. After our first rapid response disbursement in December of last year for Lake Chad Basin, this enabled us to put more capacity on the ground and to get access to people that we didn't have access to previously, and it opened our eyes to the needs that were the new needs of individuals who were unreached and had significant needs in the north part of the lake, which was the target of our second rapid response application. Finally, I'll just mention the necessity of checking the FTS, and OCHA here did a really good job with the agencies to get the current funding picture. They constantly were over months undertaking consultations with the agencies and NGOs here and in headquarters to get as accurate a picture of the situation as possible, which you can understand was very important when we come to the point of prioritizing. So I'll stop there and over to you, Panos.
Thank you, Stephen. Really helpful to hear your reflections on challenges. I'm glad you did not talk about any blood on the carpet or in the floor, but clearly your path going through the operations, through the cluster, the intercluster, the link between the intercluster and the ATT, really an approach where, as you said, there is transparency, there is inclusiveness, there is prioritization. These are all really vital steps to make it successful, to bring everybody on board, and most importantly, to use the funds in a way that makes a difference on people's lives being in extremely difficult situations. I see a lot of questions that have come my way, and there is still time for any of you who want to send a question now. We still have another 15 minutes to the end of this webinar. I'm going to take the next question to Lisa. And Lisa, actually we have from Panama, from NGO Consortium, multiple sources who came up with the same question, with the same challenge. And the question is, a colleague says, I'm working in what I think is a slow onset emergency. How do I know that that would fit within the CERF eligibility for funding? As a humanitarian coordinator, do I take it forward and with the ATT, with the operations? And if yes, I just want to make sure that indeed it fits the criteria to move forward with the request. Lisa, over to you.
Yes, thanks for the question. It is actually a frequent one also that we receive. And of course, since El Nino has become such a major influencer across the globe, starting in 2015, the CERF actually developed some guidelines for slow onset disasters, in particular drought. So that can be found on our website, and I think included in the summary that you send, then we can include our website and maybe a couple of important links that would help flesh out some of these answers. But just in brief, there has to be a significant change in nutrition, health, and the different sectors, which would narrow down to specific time frame, population, and a region. So again, referencing El Nino, so from 2015 to date, until this year, CERF has allocated over almost $120 million to 19 different countries. So with that example, you can see that, yes, almost 20 countries, almost 120 million, received CERF grants with using this basically under the drought guidance. So, and I would also mention that we are currently underway with the Underfunded Emergencies round, the first round for 2017. And with that round, although we had a policy, or actually the Emergency Relief Coordinator had a policy to give only one-time allocation to El Nino affected countries, this was because we had several repeat, or let's say returning countries asking for additional, and it was not possible because of the limited amount of funding that we have, the $450 million. And of course, this hopefully will be improved once we move to $1 billion by 2018. But what I would say is that with this upcoming round of the underfunded emergencies, that El Nino affected countries are eligible if they meet the criteria. So not to say that all will be there, but of course the analysis is being undertaken both within the CERF Secretariat, but also with the Underfunded Emergencies Working Group that is being led by FAO this particular round.
Lisa, thanks. That's really helpful. And indeed, we will include these guidelines with the summary notes so colleagues in slow onset emergencies understand the parameters and the eligibility to go ahead with the CERF funding. Lisa, there's another question I'm going to take to you. And again, there is three colleagues listening who sent the same question, which basically says, I'm working in an operation where there isn't an OCHA office in country, where we think there is, well, there definitely needs, and we would like to explore the possibility of moving forward. How do we go about this? What is the appropriate steps? Do we call you directly, or how do we go to make sure that the request is timely and focused and prioritized and so on? Lisa, over to you.
Okay, thanks for that question. And I did see one online, maybe that was one of them as well, but asking whether it's possible to receive a CERF allocation if there is no OCHA. Absolutely there is, and some of the examples from this year are following the earthquake in Ecuador, CERF allocated funding there. Recently, Cuba, $5 million to Cuba following Hurricane Matthew, and also Democratic People's Republic of Korea and Rwanda as well. So both under rapid response and underfunded, the CERF can be allocated. And yes, I would suggest that that the RC's office be in touch with the program team here, is led by Vesna Vukovic. And so again, we're always available here to have a discussion. I am as well, and other components of the program team, other colleagues here. So there's no precondition whatsoever for OCHA to be present in these countries. As I mentioned, generally CERF provides funding to 50 different countries, and that is certainly more than where OCHA has a presence. But obviously where OCHA is present, then it is a crucial support to the CERF requests.
Thanks, thanks, Lisa. I'm sure you'll be inundated with calls or requests after this. Indeed, I hope that's helpful for colleagues, in particular where there's no OCHA office on the ground, to be able to take it forward. Stephen, we have a question that I'd like to take to you. One of the listeners said, you described the needs and the process, yet we understand to go for a CERF funding. Yet we understand that the funding that comes from CERF really only covers a small percentage of the total needed for that sector, location, or the operation on the ground. So what difference does it make, the CERF allocation, given the fact that it's so small, and why is it so important in view of the scale of the needs that you have in a country? So so the question is really about, why is it so important, even if it's small? What difference does it make? Stephen, over to you. Okay, I'm afraid we still have a technical problem with the chat. So while we'll try to sort it out, Lisa, I'm going to take another question that we have got for you. And one of the callers had the question and saying, can you give us an idea about the time frame? How long does it take from the moment we send a request till a decision is made. Is it fast enough? Can it be made faster? If the fund becomes 1 billion, would it slow down things, or how? So the question really is about the time it takes to get the funding and to get a response. And in the meantime, I hope we sort out the technical problems with Chad. So Lisa, over to you.
Okay, thanks for that question. Obviously a very important one, because I think one of the hallmarks of CERF is its speed of getting funding out. Also, I would mention that in the case that there is an allocation, often the emergency relief coordinator will announce an allocation within 12 or 48 hours of a sudden onset emergency. Obviously, those are a little bit easier and quicker to make those allocations. As we know, when there's an earthquake or a big typhoon or cyclone or hurricane, then there are some immediate needs there. And as soon as the ERC, Stephen O'Brien, makes an allocation announcement, then the country team is aware that they will receive some funding, and that most often comes with an envelope, the amount that will be provided there. And then at that point, the agencies, when they submit their requests, they of course begin dispersing supplies, procuring, and so with that, then the CERF request can be backdated by 6 weeks. So if it takes a while for the humanitarian country team to feel comfortable with the assessments that are coming out, obviously in rapid onset, then you know sort of some of the basics that will be part of that request. But any supplies that are already there for other programs can be reoriented, and then CERF can actually reimburse those if they're going to assist with the current emergency. So again, backdating six weeks makes it possible for CERF to be the earliest funding there and ready to be utilized. I'm just trying to think if there's any other. All right. Yeah. So also in terms of timing, sometimes we receive some feedback that it does take a little bit of time for a CERF request, and in many cases, again, of course, all of you that are in the HCTs and the HCs leading these realize that there are some discussions that need to happen there. Also, it can take a little bit of time if there are access issues, so security. Most recently, we had a request actually in June for support to Jordan for the Syrian refugees in the Berm. We were able to disperse $4 million very quickly to that, but then of course some very serious and severe security situation occurred there, and therefore we had to delay a bit. But then not we, but the country team had to delay the rest of their submission. And then just recently, in the last couple of days, we received their submission, and within a very quick turnaround time. From the CERF side, we aim to get back comments back to you and within 24, 48 hours. So from our side, it's very quick, but obviously sometimes there are some factors at the country level that may take a little bit longer, but we are certainly open to working with you to try to expedite these requests as much as possible.
Thanks. Thank you, Lisa. I'm going now to take us back to Chad, back to Stephen. I understand the sound technical problem is resolved. So Stephen, back to the same question. Although CERF is a small, relatively comparatively small fund comparing with the needs, what difference does it make? Why is it important from a field perspective or operational perspective? Stephen, over to you.
I think we've got it sorted again. Yes, indeed. So just over 200 million received so far for our HRP, so 10%, a small but very significant one, and the timing and visibility of the CERF funding was extremely important. First of all, let me mention, so for the rapid response window in the lake, 2 grants on that, and really in the spirit of it being a new start or addressing new needs. 1 year ago, we were reaching 55,000 displaced people in the Lake Chad area on the Chad side, and then through the increased access and capacity that we gained from the two CERF disbursements, we now have access to 115,000. So 55 to 115,000 of the displaced who are extremely vulnerable in the lake region. In the south, I'd say the underfunded window disbursement for the south of Chad, adjacent to the Central African Republic border, served its purpose to help us fine-tune our operation and presence there at a very crucial moment. With the ongoing crisis in CAR, it showed that we had continued priority and interest and readiness there on our side of the border. It also helped us with reassuring the government partners that we were not leaving them. It's been fundraising for the South has been extremely difficult in the last 2 years for agencies independent of the CERF. So this injection and commitment to the South was very important. Also in the South, well, in both cases, but particularly in the South, we had a big emphasis on tackling food insecurity and malnutrition, which took a downturn in 2016. So this was extremely important for us to again show that the CERF was coming in with quickly dispersed funds to address that before the situation for the people got much worse. Over to you.
Stephen, good to hear your reflections on that. There's about 3 minutes or so left to the end of this webinar. I'm actually going to take the last question to Lisa, but before I ask her, I want to point that in the chat box there is a link that Venkatesh Naik has just put over from the state team. Venkatesh is sitting here next to me with a link on a survey monkey that we have put out to get your feedback on this webinar. So while Lisa is answering the last question, I want to encourage you to go on this link, and we really value to hear your thoughts on what on this webinar and how you found it. Lisa, a colleague sends a message saying, is it still time at this point of the year to send applications? Have you exhausted all the funds you have? Do you still have more funds? The webinar has inspired with some suggestions that they want to go ahead, but they're not clear if it's too late for the year, given the fact that it's already November. And how's your funding? Are you able to respond to requests? Lisa, over to you.
Yes, it is never too late to submit a CERF request. Where there's a need, then we're open to receiving a request and considering that. So in terms of our funding level right now, we are short. Cash available is also a bit short, so we are contacting the donors that have made generous pledges to us to make sure they turn that into contributions as soon as possible. And we are facing a $25 million shortfall this year on the current $450 million target. So we're working toward closing that gap. But again, going back to the specific question, absolutely, we're always available here to receive requests for rapid response. Where there's a need, then we will certainly review very carefully and determine how that support, whether and how that support can be provided.
Great. Thank you, Lisa, and we do hope you get the funding shortfall really, because it's a vital service to operations, and the beauty of it is really empowering humanitarian coordinators. Decisions are made at the country level, which is really tremendously valued to be able to tailor-make the requests. Colleagues, I'm afraid this brings us to an end, to the end of this webinar. I'd like, first of all, to thank our speakers, Lisa Doughten, the chief of the CERF Fund here in New York. I'd like also to thank Stephen Tal, the resident coordinator, humanitarian coordinator in Chad. I want to thank them both for sharing their wisdom, their practical steps, their critical reflections, having been on this function from a CERF secretariat, but also from a humanitarian coordinator's perspective on what works, what really hasn't worked, because we also learn a lot. Actually, one can argue we learn more often from mistakes than just the successes or how to go about it. As a state team, we will be sending to all of you a summary note with the key tips, the key points that our speakers very generously shared with all of us. We'll also send you a link to this webinar, which will be available online. Should you wish to refer, to recommend to any other colleagues to listen to it, it will be there. I also want to remind everybody about the link with the Survey Monkey, the feedback on this webinar. If you take a minute, there is just a few very simple questions we really appreciate and value to receive your feedback, in particular since today's webinar was really simultaneously interpreted in French, Arabic, and Spanish. I want to thank the interpreters for their fantastic job to be able to broadcast for the first time in 4 languages simultaneously, and VoiceBox for really developing this this platform and program so we can use it all. So from all of us here, wish you a good day, and that brings this webinar to an end. Thank you and goodbye.